So the first part of doing the Chapter 10 research is, let's see here. Really, you're supposed to get your medical file. You're supposed to interview your patient, and you're supposed to only speak or listen to them. And you're supposed to listen to their symptoms, their family history, and you document all that on your doctor-patient form here. Once you have the information from your patient's family history and their symptoms and complaints, you take that information that you listened and wrote down on your form here, and you need to then go begin your online research, which is, the goal is to basically try to identify their disorder. That's generally, anytime a patient comes to a doctor with complaints, the goal is to identify what the patient is suffering from. So your goal is to find out what the genetic basis is for your patient and that disorder. To do that, you need to go on, it says, well, you got to go to Learn Genetics Utah, but I'll show you a different way as well. So the worksheet explains it, but you can also, if you Google chromosomal abnormalities, so Google chromosome abnormalities, and you hit enter, and then you scroll down, and your first option is Learn Genetics. You click on this, and you have these options. These are all different disorders. Your patient is going to suffer from one of these. Your patient will either have Cry-du-Chat, Down syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, or Williams syndrome. If you haven't already guessed, genetically based disorders apparently have the technical term a syndrome. So your patient is suffering from a particular syndrome. Your responsibility is to figure out what is going on with them. Which syndrome do they suffer from? And you do that by clicking on, let's say for example, Cry-du-Chat's here. We go back to, let's do Down syndrome. Everybody has typically heard of Down syndrome. Right now, there's a couple important sections in each of these to investigate. One is you need to understand what's going on with the chromosomes that led to the syndrome. In this example, Down syndrome, your patient had an extra copy of chromosome 21. So if your patient had Down syndrome, it would be important to recognize and remember for later work on the research, you need to remember that an extra copy of 21 in the chromosomes. So they have 3 copies of chromosome 21, which is 1 extra, led to the issue. You also need to understand how they get it. How do you get Down syndrome? So later on, we'll cover what is and how do you get it. We'll cover that a little better to help you think through later research. But right now, what you're most interested in is looking at the symptoms of each syndrome. So the only way that you can try to pinpoint and diagnose your patient with a particular syndrome is reading about the symptoms. So you're going to read about the symptoms, the physical or mental symptoms of someone with Down syndrome, or, again, any of the other syndromes. So you go to the top. You need to do that for all the syndromes. So for each of these syndromes, it's going to tell you the symptoms. And we'll just do 1 extra one just so you can see. So it tells you what it is, how you get it, but here are the symptoms for, say, Cry-du-Chat. So you've got to look at the symptoms of each syndrome and figure out which one matches your patient best. So you have to compare what the symptoms of your patient with the symptoms of the disorder until you find the right match. Once you've done that, you can go back to your form and predict what you think they have. All right, and that's where you do this. These are your 2 things that you saw in symptoms from your patient and the description of the syndrome that match, okay? And then finally, down in this bottom line here, you would say, my hypothesis is my patient suffers from blank syndrome. Let's do an example real quick. So let's pretend it was Down syndrome that was causing the issue. So Down syndrome. We're going to go down to the symptoms. You could say people with Down syndrome have distinct facial features, large tongue, upward slanting eyes with small folds of skin in the corners, right? So let's go with the first one. It says a small, broad nose. small, broad nose. So what I would do is, all right, so the first example would be the physical trait of their face. So that's what I'll do. I'll say, patient said people make fun of their broad, flat nose. And then you could put Down syndrome has this as a symptom for nose shape. So you can see how I'm connecting what the patient complained about. Now I'm just making up a patient. I'm pretending they had Down syndrome. All right, the next thing is, let's go for maybe one other trait. So let's look at a second trait. Let's say people with Down syndrome have increased risk of developing medically significant problems, including respiratory infections, gastrointestinal tract obstruction, heart defects, hearing loss, eye abnormalities. Well, I can pretend that the patient had a complaint. Let's say patient complained of always getting sick, and Down syndrome reports individuals often get respiratory infections. Boom. So for both of those reasons, all right. So what I would say is, my hypothesis is the patient suffers. Now let's put lives with. Puts a better spin on it. Patient lives with Down syndrome. And you, sir, are done with the first day of the research project for Chapter 10.